At heritage lines up and down the country, millions of enthusiasts still come together for regular steam gatherings.
I always remember getting off the electric train at Woking and going over the footbridge, and one of these things would come through underneath about 90 miles an hour, going straight through Woking, and the whole station would shake.
I used to holiday every year, like most families in the 50s, of course. We didn't have a great deal of money, and I used to go up and down on this line behind the M7 tanks, but it's lovely to see the bullet Pacifics again.
The locomotives that once hauled passengers and freight the length and breadth of Britain were destined for the breaker's yard as Britain's railways prepared for a bright, clean, modern future. Just 71 were spared. Yet dozens have been brought back from the dead, and thanks to preservation societies, they're thrilling new generations.
To find 5 fully restored bullet locomotives in one place is something, and also commemorates the end of Southern Steam this year.
Names like Mallard and Flying Scotsman conjured up romance and mystery.
My dad used to drive them. He used to do a boat train from Victoria down to Dover, and he was one of the drivers on the Golden Arrow.
I'm 70 this year. 50 years, it doesn't seem so long ago. It really doesn't.
Wonderful. I have a particular affection for the city of Wells.
I've been down here for decades now, and this is the busiest I've ever seen it. The trains are absolutely busting at the seams, really.
Great memories of watching them up and down the South West Main Line in the London area, but they were absolutely brilliant locomotives.
I'm Tom Hepworth, and with the help of enthusiasts and those who worked on the railways half a century ago, I'll be looking back at what some regard as a golden age and how the network modernised as we remember the South's last day of steam.
As you stand quietly before me in your coat of shining green, I reflect upon the glory of the golden age of steam. I recall a fresh-faced youngster held spellbound by your power and the hours spent with the cleaner's rag, your brass and steel to scour.
Reflections, written by Bob Cartwright, a former British Railways fireman and driver. Now he's a volunteer at the Mid-Hants Railway.
I remember too the pride with which he mounted the footplate, the qualified young fireman, a full-fledged driver's mate.
The lines from London Waterloo to the south of England carry millions of passengers every year. Their routes, though, date back to Victoria's reign.
The line was originally part of a grand scheme to link London with the Empire.
Ted Vaughan is secretary of the Solent branch of the Railway Correspondence and Travel Society.
It started as a railway plus extensive developments of the docks at Southampton. Initially it was, I believe, the London and Southampton and Docks Company. When, I suppose, funds didn't come in as intended, the Docks Company and the railway were separated and developed themselves. So the railway was developed from London to Southampton to serve the docks. The first part opened down here in 1839, and it reached the terminus station in Southampton in 1840. There was also a line from Bishopstoke, which is now Eastleigh, to Gosport, London to Portsmouth, I think it was 1857. Let's think of Bournemouth. You look at it today, an important seaside resort, an important town. The first railway missed Bournemouth. It went from Southampton through Ringwood and Wimborne to Hamworthy and then Dorchester. The person behind it principally was a Wimborne solicitor by the name of Mr. Castleman. And Bournemouth first got a railway from the east in 1860 from Ringwood to Christchurch, but it was then extended to Bournemouth just east of the present station. And the line that we think of today as the main line to Bournemouth didn't come into full operation until 1888.
So for the best part of 100 years, steam ruled the rails. Those smaller companies were amalgamated and one by one swallowed up into one of the Big Four.
The Big Four came in 1923 when it became the Southern Railway, and then in 1948 on nationalisation, the major part of the Southern Railway became the Southern Region. The Southern Region covering everything from Kent through, and you can say the main line from Waterloo to Exeter, and virtually everything south of that had come into the southern region. And from Exeter, initially, it continued round to the North Devon and Cornwall resorts, Padstow, Bude, Ilfracombe.
But those changes were nothing compared to what was to come. The Summer of Love was to see the start of a new, cleaner, faster and more efficient railway.
Smooth, isn't it? And quiet. It's due to the continuous welded rail, newly laid all the way, the cushion-sprung bogies and underfloor insulation. Gives cigarettes a better ride, too.
On the 9th of July 1967, the last steam haul service was pulled on British Rail's southern region. This British transport film celebrated the new era.
Now, between London, Southampton and Bournemouth, electricity sweeps all that away and sweeps on with travel fit for the 70s. Clean, quiet, fast and frequent.
In the early 1940s, most European countries started to make the switch to diesel or electric traction. The rail networks in Germany and France had been rebuilt after the Second World War and used the opportunity to modernise. But here in Britain, the railway largely survived. Well, just about. It was run down and in need of investment.
Well, the Second World War left the four big private companies completely bankrupt. As far as their infrastructure was concerned, pretty much smashed up as well.
Danny Hopkins, the editor of Steam magazine, speaking on the BBC 4 documentary The Last Days of Steam.
Really, that's why British Railways came into being, because the war had rendered the railways almost inoperable as a private source of income to a certain extent.
2,500 new locomotives were built between the end of the war and 1960. Here's how Pathé News reported it.
Operated for more than 100 years without a break. Feeding a war machine for 6 weary years without adequate renewals and repairs that left them as tired as the rest of us.
Britain was rebuilding after a destructive war. The railways had to make do and mend.
Make do and mend, and that must have applied until the early 50s.
The Big Four finally came together on the 1st of January 1948 as the nationalised British Railways, created as part of the Transport Act of 1947.
It's just a few minutes before midnight, and in very soon the signalman here will signal in the last Great Western Railway train to pass through Reading.
The new organisation inherited everything: the infrastructure, tracks, signals and buildings, the locomotives and rolling stock, even hotels and ships, and a workforce of close to 1 million.
We're knocking 4 railways into one. That's bound to cause a bit of a clatter. We're taking the thing a stage further than it had already gone. To save waste and overlapping, we've got to standardise. And standardisation on such a big scale as this can only be done as it comes. Each railway in the Big Four group had their own way of doing things. Now what we have to do is to examine them all and take the best from each. Everything from carriage bogies to signalling.
When I first started at Eastleigh, I think there were about 280 sets of men. By that I mean a driver and a fireman.
Bob Cartwright is one of the volunteers at the Mid-Hants Railway. In the early 60s, he was just starting a career and life on the railways.
That was the actual footplate men themselves. The shed itself probably had a team of 20, 25 fitters per shift on a 3-shift system, plus the people to wash the engines out, plus the coalmen that used to work the crane, the coal. There were probably per shift, 80 to 100 people tied up in that shed, in the running of that shed, plus all the drivers. The place doesn't exist anymore and the railway still runs.
Having invented the railways, Britain was now lagging behind the times. Change had to come.
It had to happen. They were extremely inefficient machines. 75-80% of the heat that you originally got from the coal probably went out of the chimney and ended up in the atmosphere. And they were really labour intensive. But some of the old codgers were not very happy about the way the railway was going, because the railway was seen to be on a downhill at that time. Modernisation was in the offing. A lot of people thought that it was going to be the end for railways. And a lot of the really old guys didn't like it, and some of them were very grumpy about having to take young lads who hadn't got much idea out on the track with them. And it was a very difficult and steep learning curve. But we got there.
I've got the Comet, I've got the Lancastrian, I've got the Prince of Wales, my dad's a railwayman.
The phenomenon of train spotting started here on the southern region.
I went to a boys' school at Stoughton near Guildford.
Jeff Birch is a volunteer at the Midhants Railway.
Luckily, there was a railway line running right past the school. I thought, well, why is such an interest in trains going by? And these locomotives would go by. And the boys at school would have Ian Allen train spotting books, and they would be taking the numbers of these trains.
Steam train, there goes the Super D. Write the name and number down for 0193.
It was his train spotting hobby that eventually led him to a career on the railways.
We went round train spotting at various locations, but the penny dropped when I was allowed onto the footplate of a locomotive at Woking Station. I tentatively asked the driver if I could clamber up on board, and he said yes. From then on, I was hooked, and I thought, well, this will be the job for me.
Stations like London Waterloo were a mecca for youngsters like Jeff and Ted Vaughan.
As a nipper, a day in London meant coming up to Waterloo. Oh, the steam train's here.
The steam locos sat side by side with their replacements, the newer models.
What, this?
Experiments for modernisation had been taking place for decades and were starting to be noticed.
Really, the steam started disappearing as far as Waterloo was concerned, I'd say about 1960. By then, limited number of diesels coming in, but it was really 1966 when electrification to Bournemouth was beginning to get benefits. At that stage, a few trains were turned over to electric or diesel. And although steam remained until 67, every so often you'd realise that there's a little more in the way of electric power there.
The line to Portsmouth had been electrified decades before.
1937-38, Portsmouth via Guildford, the main line.
Here's Ted Vaughan again.
OK, there might have been an early morning mail train come newspaper train, but basically the service had by then gone over to electric. The Southern Railway had looked at electrification, and it was something like 1930. The general manager apparently announced to the board, "Gentlemen, I have decided to electrify to Brighton," which was quite adventurous at that time. Brighton being very much one of the seaside resorts, and bank holidays and what have you, a lot of people would head that way. So he started with Brighton and then gradually expanded to Worthing, Littlehampton, Eastbourne, Hastings, Bognor, Portsmouth. And every year or so there was a little bit more in the way of electrification.
Robert Riddles was British Railway's chief engineer, charged with dragging the railway into the second half of the 20th century. His view was that diesel or electric traction were the only two options to move railways forward. But there was unrest in Europe.
Almost certainly without the war, electrification would have extended a little bit more. I have seen reports that there were thoughts of going as far as Basingstoke and then transferring from electric locomotives to either steam or possibly diesel, extending to Exeter, Bournemouth, Weymouth. And that was in the immediate post-war era. But of course it took another 15-20 years before any real plans came about to electrify down this way.
As the railway just about survived the war and we had the fuel, modernisation of the network was put on hold after the war ended. Oil was expensive too.
Hence, I suppose, we continued building steam engines when European countries were thinking of other means. We had coal in this country. We got the facilities for steam, albeit very poor. And the thought was, we can't start developing diesel and electric. The country just hadn't got the money to do it. And it was the modernisation programme of 1955 which really started the change.
But by the mid-60s, Britain's love affair with the railway was beginning to wane.
Riding along in my automobile.
More and more of us were buying cars, and less freight was being carried. British Railways was becoming less profitable.
Cruising and playing the radio with no particular place to go.
In 1963, the much-talked-about Beeching Report was published.
There's never been a doomsday book of British Railways like this. Remote areas of the Highlands will lose their services. Wales takes a body blow as well. In the northeast, little more than the main north-south links will remain. Holiday resorts in the West Country share the fate of many market towns. No station, no passenger trains. And North Devon and North Cornwall resorts are especially hit.
No more will I go to Blandford Forum and Morty-Ho. On the slow train from Midsummer Norton and Mumby Road. No churns, no porter, no cat on a seat at Chorlton come Harney or Chester Street. We won't be meeting again on the slow train.
Dr. Beeching saw the electrification of the railways as being essential for its modernisation. The dirty old machines had no place in a forward-thinking 1960s Britain. The writing was on the wall for steam.
British Railways were promised a new lease of life, a vast modernisation plan to be carried out over 15 years at a cost of more than £1,500 million. The days of the grand old steam locomotives were numbered.
I'm Tom Hepworth, and you're listening to a special programme on BBC Radio Solent, marking 50 years since the end of mainline steam here in the south. As the new electric trains didn't require firemen, jobs were lost too. And for those who kept their jobs, a massive retraining programme was launched. Here's Bob Cartwright again.
The last couple of years were very uncertain times for us. I'd gone on the railway with a view to staying there. But of course you had all these old codgers saying, oh, when they get rid of the steam, they won't want you firemen. But some very far-sighted individuals on the nationalised railway system at the time thought we're going to need these lads. And when Jeff in particular, when he moved for his driving job, the London area was horrendously short.
But for those who stayed, it allowed for plenty of overtime.
There were 100 drivers' vacancies on the southern region in the London area alone, and they were desperate for us to move. But as a second man at Eastleigh, I went from working on the steam to being a driver's assistant. And we were doing some very, very interesting work. And again, you would be allowed to do a lot of driving. The Freightliner system had just come in. We were going now onto other regions, which we didn't used to do before. We were going to Banbury and sometimes Birmingham, North London. Very interesting work. And I stayed as a second man. And as a senior second man, your money was quite good. It was a steady income. But eventually, I gave in to the dangled carrot of loads of overtime to pay the mortgage off, and off I went to London as a driver. And at that time, I mean, I have a diary that when I went to London in the first year that I was there, once I got driving, I think I went to London 70 days on the trot. And that was how it was then. Prior to some of the terrible accidents we later had where they decided we can't let people keep doing this, you could work every single day of the year, almost, if you wanted to. But the end of steam itself was a great time of uncertainty for us. We weren't sure what was going to happen. And if it hadn't been for these people with lots of foresight, they would have lost a lot of valuable, well-trained people. The safety of the railway depended an awful lot on the man at the sharp end. If a driver, for any reason, decided that he, for instance, wasn't going to take an engine, or even if he wasn't going to take a fireman, and some of them would refuse to take junior firemen, no one would argue with him, because that man at the end of the day was the one who was going to pick up the tab if anything went wrong. drivers really were king of the road in the steam days. What drivers said, unless it was outrageously out of order, if a driver said he wasn't going to do something, it was accepted that it wouldn't get done. And I think the railways remained a pretty safe place to be for all the years of steam because of that culture.
Seniority.
That it was a seniority thing. It was also in those days, an awful lot of the management within the grade itself had done the job. They'd been there, they'd done the job, and they had a great deal of respect for the people that were still doing the job.
Although too young to have been promoted to driver status in the days of steam, that didn't mean people like Jeff Birch didn't get to take control.
Although I wasn't passed for driving as a 21-year-old or 19-year-old or whatever, some of the drivers, of course, let you do the driving. And my particular driver, Stan Harms, he was a portly chap, and he would quite like to do the firing every other day, so to keep his weight down. So it was great for me because it was a great introduction into driving steam locomotives, and gave me plenty of opportunities to do that. I was 21 years old when steam finished, and we then moved, which all the drivers and firemen there transferred to Woking, and it was called Woking Mixed Traction Depot. So I became the second man there for the next 2 years, and then once I became 23 years of age, I went for my medical, and then I went for rules examination, and then after that I went for 3 weeks training on electric traction. It was my first traction, if you like, for to become a trained driver. Although you weren't actually called a driver then, you were a passed man, you were a passed second man. So you had to get your driver's job either at that depot by waiting there for dead men's shoes, if you like, or you moved away to another depot to get your driver's job.
And the transition away from steam in 1967 removed the need for a lot of the dirty jobs at both ends of the shift. Here's Jeff Birch again.
At the very end of the day, let's say, when you had to dispose of the engine, and there were disposal gangs as well, you'd be booked to dispose of an engine, and what I mean by that is that you'd have to clean the smoke box out, you'd have to clean the fire, and of course rake out the ash afterwards, go underneath and rake the ash out from underneath the pit. And sometimes you'd get locomotives that didn't have drop grates or didn't have rocker grates, so that all that job had to be done by hand. Now, the Great Western region had fire droppers specially to do that job, so they were very lucky. But as a young fireman at Guildford, lots of our locomotives didn't have drop grates, so you were expected to dispose of the engine yourself by doing the smoke box, as I say, then having to take out all the clinker and ash of that fire and leave it for the next person, obviously, to take on.
And you would do that with great long shovels, anything up to 10 foot long.
Yeah.
And of course, as you're shoveling the hot ash out, with clean fire still in there, the handles of these shovels would get horrendously hot. And if you had any common sense, you never wore gloves, because if the glove got hot, you had to get it off. We used to roll up a cloth in the palm of our hands, and you knew when things were starting to get really hot when the cloth started to singe.
Smoke,
but if it got hot, you could always just drop it, and off you go.
They joined to the driver's steam brake pipe, begun to sweat a little. By the time they were halfway up the hill, it was coming in a steady trickle.
You get underneath an engine to rake the ash from the container called the ash pan underneath. And if the wind's blowing the wrong way, as soon as you pull the ash out, it would all go over you, and you'd come out looking like, well, I don't know what you'd look like, but you were covered in ash.
Sure, you were definitely upwind a bit.
Health and safety now, they do their crust if they saw what we used to do then, wouldn't we?
As dirty as the jobs were, there was a great pride in footplate cleanliness.
You tried to keep yourself as clean as possible, and you had a water pet pipe to keep the dust down, etc. But lots of drivers didn't like you using that because it affected their rheumatism. So don't get that near me, boy.
A driver once said to me, he said, "There's only one tool you're going to use more than that shovel nipper." And that's that beep and brush in the corner there. and it was pointed out to me that if you don't sweep the few lumps of coal that fall off the shovel when you're shoveling coal, you're bound to drop a little bit. You leave that there and twist your ankle on it, that's going to put you in great difficulty. They were insistent that you keep the footplate cleaned up, and some of them were insistent that you keep plenty of water around to keep the dust down. You could stay pretty clean.
If you kept the cab clean, you kept the implements, etc. clean, then you kept yourself clean.
One of the implements that you'd have on an engine is a bucket, and you used to keep the hand brush in the bucket, but you'd constantly have that bucket filled with reasonably clean water from your slacking pipe, and it was nothing to wash up 2 or 3 times in a trip to keep yourself a bit clean. So it was possible, especially if after you prepared your engine you'd allowed yourself enough time to go and have a good wash, you could say work from Eastleigh to Bournemouth and arrive at in reasonable condition. One of the delightful things that I do now, and I frequently do this here, and it was something that was said to me when I was a young man, the indication of whether we've had a good day or not, he said, is not how much steam we've had or whether we lost any time. He said, it's a state of my collar when I get home, he says. And if you've kept everything swept up and damped down, you'd go home and his collar wouldn't be too bad. Obviously, on a bad day, you used to come off looking like rooks.
For anyone who's only experienced modern traction, it's hard to remember how labour-intensive it all was, just getting these machines ready for work.
You would have a look to see what your engine was, you would wander across the shed, and then you would have to look and make sure you've got all the necessary tools, oil bottle, shovel, lamps, etc. And you'd have a look to make sure you've got water in the boiler and the fire was alight, start to spread the fire over and build it up. If you had any common sense, you'd go to the stores and draw supply of oil for the engine to save your driver having to do that. Leave him a neatly folded cloth on it so that when he turned up, he hasn't got to do that. Anything up to 1 hour and 5 minutes of quite intensive work to get the engine ready, make sure there was no lumps of coal going to fall off the tender. And you could put anything up to slightly over a tonne of coal into a firebox. And the quality of coal that we used to get then is very different to what it is now. It was a lot of, if you were lucky, you got hold of good quality Welsh steam coal, and you could literally fill a firebox up with that, and over the next 3/4 of an hour or so, whilst you went to Waterloo to pick up the train, that would start to cook. If it was going to have a long day, you would top the tender up again. By the time it was, for instance, if it was due to whatever time you do leave Waterloo, that coal would hopefully have got hot and cooked. So you wouldn't have to do a lot until you got to somewhere like at Wimbledon, and then you would start putting 3 or 4 shovels at a time, 5 or 6 shovels at a time, just to keep that fire up. Because if an engine worked hard, they could start to tear the fire a bit, and if the fire was too thin, you'd have a job to keep 50 odd square feet of grate covered with the size of shovel you had. And I suppose probably you wouldn't work right through from Waterloo to Weymouth. London men used to work through to Bournemouth and get off, and then Weymouth men or Bournemouth men would take the train on down. But you'd probably get through 2.5 tonne over and above what you put on in the first place.
It was a constant process, making sure the engines had enough fuel, particularly on the long run between Waterloo and Weymouth.
Especially water-wise for a start, because you've got, 5,000 gallons of water. You'd be taking water at least once on the way down to Weymouth. You'd take it at Southampton and probably again at Bournemouth.
I mean, part of the driver's work when he signs on is to look at the notices, see if there's any speed restrictions anywhere. And one of the important things was to make sure that when you got to a station where you thought you were going to need to take water, that there was water available. There were water notices out. But that's what would happen. You would turn up at Southampton, and over the next 5 minutes, you would run in, stop in the right place, swing the water crane round, put the pipe in, turn the water on, fill the tender right up with water again. Some of the older guys were very nervous about water. You might have enough water to get where you were going, but just to be absolutely sure, in case you got held up, they would top it right up.
The volunteers from the Mid-Hants Railway remember all too well how no 2 journeys on steam engines were the same.
You could do the same job 3 days running with the same loco and the same sort of load. All 3 days might go totally different. It was a very unpredictable technology. These days you turn a light on or anything, it either comes on or it doesn't. With a steam engine, you're never too sure exactly how things are going to go, depending on the fuel, etc., and who your mate is and how he works it, and etc. It took you at least 6 months to be able to get through a good day without any input from your driver, and that's doing it every day. And it would normally take a good deal longer than that before you could handle pretty much anything that come along. If an engine started to play up and refused to steam properly, you were quite heavily reliant on your driver to say, if I was you, I'd do a so-and-so. And if you had any common sense, you listened to what he said and did it, because you were very... And these guys were highly experienced, and they were absolutely wonderful people to work with, and their knowledge was unbelievable.
And even if you had the same class of locomotive, each one would be entirely different to work with. They were living things, they really were. Each one had its own temperament, and that's why they're called cheese.
Yeah. They could answer back. Undoubtedly.
You're listening to a special programme here on BBC Radio Solent, marking 50 years since the end of steam on the main line here in the south. I'm Tom Hepworth. Electrification didn't happen overnight. As we heard earlier, the Waterloo to Portsmouth line was modernised before the Second World War, and on the Isle of Wight, one line survived the cuts. But turn back the pages of time, and there was quite a network that spanned the island, as Roger Silsbury, a lifelong rail enthusiast and a member of the Isle of Wight Steam Railway, explains.
At its zenith, there were 55.5 route miles on the island, which for an island that measures sort of 23 miles east-west and 13 north-south, that's quite a network.
The island's first public railway opened in June 1862 and was operated by the Cowes and Newport Railway Company.
Well, there were 8 return trips between Cowes and Newport each day, and 2 on Sundays.
Followed by a line from Ryde St John's Road to Shanklin. But plans had been put forward years earlier.
There were schemes in about the 1840s to bring railways to the Isle of Wight, but the landed gentry were totally opposed to it, and they blocked it at every turn. But it wasn't until the late 1850s when schemes were actually promoted and succeeded in getting their Act of Parliament and the lines constructed.
The main line took 3 years to construct, but these were just 2 of the island's lines.
There was one called the Ryde and Newport Railway, which opened in 1875. There was one called the Isle of Wight Newport Junction Railway, which ran from Newport to Sandown. That opened in stages because of constructional difficulties in the Newport area, but it finally opened throughout in 1879. And these 3 companies amalgamated to form the Isle of Wight Central Railway in 1887. Other lines did follow. There was a line from Brading to Bembridge, which opened in 1882. There was a line from Newport through the rural West Wight out as far as Freshwater, which opened in 1889. And then the final little bit of the jigsaw was a railway from Merston through initially to St Lawrence, which opened in 1897 and extended through to Ventnor in 1900. And that completed the island's network.
At the turn of the 20th century, there was even talk of the island's network being directly connected to the mainland.
There was indeed. In fact, there were several schemes, and they ranged from ones from Portsmouth to Ryde, from just west of Southampton Water across to Cowes, and from the Lymington area across to the West Wight. And it was this last one, from Lymington to West Wight, which was the most serious and which actually had parliamentary approval. Had that ever been built, the whole railway history of the island would probably have changed completely. But unfortunately, the First World War intervened, and so the plans just lay dormant. They were resurrected briefly by the Southern Railway when it came into being in 1923, but the economic situation just didn't warrant it, and so it became yet another pipe dream.
By the middle of the 1950s, the island's rail network was in decline. One by one, the lines closed, leaving just the one line on the national rail network. Here's Ted Vaughan once again.
The whole of the network was due to close on the island, but it was felt that Sandown to Ryde was too busy and had to be retained. And it was retained.
Electrification of the island line was relatively straightforward.
Early 1967 it started, I think it was April 67.
Preparatory work to allow for the brand new electric service on the main Waterloo to Bournemouth line was underway.
I think it was no more than about 3 years. Laying the conductor rail, putting in all the power installations right through. In comparison with some of the work today, it was more than likely a very short time.
And had to be completed with some tracks still in use, while express trains thundered past.
Health and safety was slightly different to what it is today, and things that we would not allow today were quite acceptable. And you didn't get the accidents.
But the power ran out just west of Bournemouth. The line to Weymouth would have to wait another 20 years before the third rail was extended.
Well, it went to Branksome, where the trains reversed and went into the depot at Bournemouth West, as was. At Bournemouth, the trains were taken over by diesel locos. The southern region had also developed pull-push working for the diesel locos, so at Weymouth, the train didn't need to do any shunting. The diesel loco pushed the coaches back to Bournemouth, hooked them onto the power unit, which was waiting there. And that applied for another 20 years.
And of course, there was a massive driver retraining programme.
Drivers were being trained on diesel traction and electric traction, etc. We're talking sometimes of drivers being up to 65 years of age that were only conversant with a regulator and a brake handle. And then suddenly they would have to work these locomotives that were well before their time. They really were. They were fantastic machines, but well beyond the capability of some of the drivers that were working them. So invariably, they would give you the option to drive rather than make a fool of themselves, if you like.
Bob Cartwright from the Mid-Hants Railway once again.
Probably the most complex bit of kit they had in their house at the time was the radio.
They were absolutely frightened stiff of even shutting the engine down, just for fear it wouldn't start again.
In the days of steam, a vast amount of driver training had been learnt on the job. Young men working their way up through the ranks were taught the way of life by the experienced drivers. The brand new technology meant a change in the way drivers were trained.
In 1966, between, let's say, the last year of steam, they obviously realised that they had to get this electrification scheme finished by the 9th or the 10th of July, because it was going to be, the transition period was going to be overnight.
The third rail system was favoured rather than overhead lines, which are now more commonplace. Here's Ted Vaughan once again.
1909, the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway had electrified from Victoria round to London Bridge with overhead. And they did a certain amount of expansion of the overhead network. Meanwhile, the London and South Western Railway had electrified, I think it was 1914, the first part, going out to places like Kingston, Teddington, Shepperton type of place. But they were using third rail, the same as London Underground was developing. When the Southern Railway came about, they looked at the two options and decided there was a greater mileage of third rail than overhead, and they felt the future at that time was better being third rail than overhead. So gradually they developed the network third rail and converted the then overhead sections to third rail. I think people looked at the idea, possibly took fright at the thought of overhead wires having to be installed between Waterloo and Clapham Junction, for example. Look at the number of tracks there, the width. How difficult will it be? And I imagine that with the scheme having to be done partly on the cheap, they looked and said, 25 kV may be the future, may be nice, but we cannot consider it at present.
I'm Tom Hepworth, and you're listening to a special programme on BBC Radio Solent, marking 50 years since the end of mainline steam here in the south. As steam gave way to cleaner methods of traction, huge crowds turned out as one by one the old engines were retired.
I'm the last of the good old-fashioned steam train.
Jeff Birch and Bob Cartwright both remember the 9th of July 1967. steam's final day.
I was actually on the last day, so I was booked on at 8 a.m. And on the roster it said against my name, engines to Salisbury if required. This was on 9th of July 1967, a Sunday. The two locomotives that were the same type, the 73 standards, were going to run together, coupled together. So I was on 73155 with driver Brain, and Pat Kinsella and Dave Elston were going to be on the other locomotive. We're going down the main line, hundreds of people out that day, waving from bridges, lots of whistle work being produced there, and hundreds of people waving and cheering off of various bridges, etc., and platforms on the way. The very last loco, 30072, this is the USA class, went a different route. It went to Fratton and then got more fuel and water there, and then went across to Salisbury that way.
I took engine number 80133, and with another engine of the same class, we left Eastleigh and went via Romsey to Salisbury. And much to my regret now, the intention then was to get over as quickly as possible and get away home. I always regret that, because there was much to be seen over there, and I should have recorded that sort of thing. Again, I've got a lot of regrets over not recording stuff in those days. It would be extremely acceptable to a lot of people now to have film and photographs of that time. But we took the engines to Salisbury, put them on a disposal pit, dropped the fire, and left them for the Salisbury shed engineman to put them away. I don't remember feeling particularly sad about it. We all thought that because of the problems that they'd had at various times, that the next thing we'd be going over there and getting some back. This had already happened on the Western region. The Western region had a lot of problems with its particular choice of diesel traction, and they did have to hire locomotives back from scrapyards to keep the job running. We felt sure it would happen, but of course it didn't.
Now officially retired, many locos were sent to be scrapped in Wales.
They were towed away in 3s and 4s. A lot of them went to South Wales, didn't they?
Yes. But some were saved from the cutting torch.
They were cutting these wagons up, and then one or two people started to come along and offer Mr. Woodham big money for the remains of the steam engines. And he, being a businessman, quickly latched on that there was money in this. And he made an awful lot of money out of doing that, selling them back to places like this, and they were then done up.
Thank God he did. Yes.
Well, yes, yeah.
And of course there was new rolling stock, carriages and engines for the network too. Well, I say new.
It was existing coaches which were modified and improved, driving compartments put in where necessary, but it was basically the stock from the late 50s, early 60s, which had been loco-hauled stock, again as part of the reduction in cost. And the first really new trains for the line, you could say, came in, or the express units, with the 442s in 1988.
And the Island Line had its own challenges when it came to the carriages.
The mainland coaching stock wouldn't fit through Ryde Tunnel. It was too big, and that is why they took over pre-1923 underground stock, modified it and put it across on the island. People describe it as a preserved railway run by the national network. Because, all right, the 1923 stock became life expired and was replaced, but the present stock dates from 1938.
There's no doubt steam enjoyed an Indian summer, and some of the newer engines were expected to end their working lives in the 1970s and 80s. So, could steam have carried on for longer? Here's Bob Cartwright again.
A lot of us that were on the job at that time believe that possibly they should have persevered with keeping the steam engines a little bit longer, because there was an awful lot of problems at that time. You could have got away with 4 basic types of locomotive, and the country ended up 55, 60 different classes, and many of them were found to be seriously wanting. Had they have not been stampeded into the modernisation programme, they could have persevered with a fairly modern fleet of engines for another few years and developed a reliable fleet of steam locomotives.
Here's Ted Vaughan again.
Having decided to do away with steam, we did what I think was something a little bit silly. Obsessed, we've got to get rid of steam quickly. We'll buy all of these diesels, many of which were untried. Some of the types didn't work, and after maybe 5 years, they were just cut up. So if steam had been kept for another 5 years in certain areas, we'd have had a longer life for the steam locos. It would have benefited because they were modern machines. Maybe that would have been better. Hindsight is a marvellous thing.
Although steam had been banished from the southern region, it still had another year left on the network further north. 2 engines pulled the very last scheduled steam service on British Railways on the 11th of August 1968, running between Liverpool and Manchester and on to Carlisle. Britannia Pacific Oliver Cromwell pulled the very last steam express. 50 years on, steam still captures the imagination of thousands. In 2008, A1 class Tornado became the first brand new mainline locomotive in Britain since Evening Star was built back in March 1960. It cost £3 million. The romance of steam returned to the mainline on St Valentine's Day in 2017 when Tornado hauled the scheduled 0825 Appleby to Skipton service, and the BBC's Danny Savage was on board.
It's a long time since the mid-morning service from Skipton attracted this sort of attention. On the footplate, the crew were working hard. Tons of coal were shovelled as the train went back and forth between Skipton and Appleby. This may be the start of something special on Britain's railways.
And in April 2017, she reached that magical speed once again.
Come on! Trailing wind, anything? Anything! Everyone jump up in the air! Yes! Oh! Oh, God!
Swinging about a bit and trying to stand our ground, but it was good fun.
We've got everything from 99.9 and who knows what to 101.6. And that's the problem with doing these things with so many different speed recording pieces of equipment.
In '68, they said the steam age was done. Last night proved legends are still being written.
Tom Ingle reporting for BBC News. And of course, the Flying Scotsman continues to draw crowds as she tours the UK, recorded here, passing Redbridge in Hampshire in 2016. So the end of steam was actually far from the end. In fact, it signalled the start of the next generation of steam, thanks to preservation societies and heritage lines like Swanage Railway, the Isle of Wight Steam Railway and the Mid-Hants Railway, where a major restoration project's now underway.
We are now in the boiler shop in Ropley. This is our main facility where we completely restore and overhaul the locomotive's boilers.
Dave Dean is overseeing the Canadian Pacific project.
This is Canadian Pacific's boiler, the largest boiler that we have in here on our flagship locomotive. It's a huge job. It's just physically, if nothing else, it's in quite a tired condition, so we're having to replace a lot of the metalwork, particularly in the firebox and the smoke box as well. And you can see the smoke box at the moment. It's standing on its side, looking a little like a funnel on a ship.
Special events draw enthusiasts in their thousands to preserved lines, all wanting to relive or experience for the first time the thrill of a steam engine close-up.
About the first time we've had so many Bully Pacifics in preservation since 1967.
Peter Frost was in charge of Battle of Britain Class 34053, Sir Keith Park, at Swanage Railway's Bullied Weekend in 2017.
It's a Bully Pacific built by a designer called Bully for the Southern Railway, as I said, in 1947. The engine, it's called Sir Keith Park 34053, and it's a mainline locomotive that would have worked between Weymouth and Waterloo many of its days, and also probably in the eastern region as well. Probably ended over in the west of the southern region, as far as Weybridge maybe, and ended up in its days in Barry Scrapyard at the end of steam. So a bit of a sad tale, but it's been recovered and rebuilt by Southern Locomotives Limited, who are based in Swanage here in Dorset.
And what's she like to drive?
It's a treat, yeah. It's a big thrill, of course. I mean, I've been involved in railways all my life, and I think today's one of the finest days for me, yeah, without a doubt.
While a whole new generation is enjoying the magic of steam, thanks to the passion of preservation societies, the writings of Reverend Audrey, of course, who used to live in Ampfield in Hampshire, creator of Thomas the Tank Engine. In fact, there are 536 miles of heritage railway in the UK now, and it's growing. But sadly, the number of those who drove the original steam engines is dwindling. Jeff Birch from the Midhants Railway.
One of the things I miss about this job, I said, is the old characters that were on the job now. And I was at that time just over 60, no, pushing 60 I think, and he said to me, have you ever thought you might be one? And I thought, how wonderful to be like that, because they were. You know, they all had their nicknames. Stooge Wilmore,
Wobbler Wilmot.
Muddy Hands, a driver called Fred Hands, they used to call him Muddy Hands. They all had their nicknames. Splinter Wood, yeah, we had one of them. When I think back, the oldest man that I worked with, an old guy called Reggie Parker, and he deserves to be remembered, he started on the Great Western Railway as a cleaner and bar boy in 1914. And I used to work with Reg, and we all thought he was a bit quaint because he was determined to get 52 years in on the job. And I used to think, well, how quaint. But I now sit here and think, why didn't I talk to that guy about the things he had seen in his time on the railway? And of course, I'm now 55 years into the job. I think people regard me as being a bit quaint, but there you go. But that's how it was.
These people, of course, had started work before the First World War, and were, as I say, between the age of 60 to 65 years of age. And you learnt so much from these men. Obviously, some of them were a bit liverish sometimes when they came to work in the mornings, but sometimes it was a treat to come to work, to be at work with these men, because you knew you were going to have a great time.
There is a world of difference between an enthusiastic railwayman and a railway enthusiast in many, many cases, and that's a fact. But it was a fascinating time, and I'd do it all again tomorrow.
As you stand quietly before me in your coat of shining green, I reflect upon the glory of the golden age of steam. I recall a fresh-faced youngster held spellbound by your power, and the hours spent with the cleaner's rag, your brass and steel to scour. I remember too the pride with which he mounted the footplate, the qualified young fireman, a full-fledged driver's mate. He deftly swung the shovel, the white-hot fire to feed, and provide you with the lifeblood that gave your wheels their speed. And later, on a greater thrill, the stuff of schoolboy's dream, to set the gear, release the brake, unleash the power of steam. To feel your lifelike motion as you moved the heavy load, it seemed you could pull the world along the iron road. Then came the politician's axe, the scrapman's fiery sword, but spared from both you stand here now, painstakingly restored. There were times when I cursed you, and you brought me close to tears, but I still look back with pleasure on those carefree, happy years.
It was a really social railway. You knew everybody and everybody knew you, and it was a wonderful way of life. There were difficult times, undoubtedly there were. As I say in my poem, there were times when after a really hard day with somebody who wasn't going to give you any assistance, you went home and thought, I don't think I want to do this anymore. And I have to say, once or twice you thought, what more can I do? And I wrote a story about that a few years back about a terrible trip one night with a parcels train to Salisbury and a driver who barely said 2 or 3 words to me all night. And that was very early on in my career, and I really struggled. And I thought, there's got to be a better job than this. But I stuck with it, and I'm still here now, and I'm glad I did. But there you go.
I'm Tom Hepworth. For me, steam is about the smell, the sight, the sounds. To me, steam engines are almost living, breathing machines, a sublime mix of grace and power. But I guess behind all the romance of steam, I've got the utmost respect and a little bit of envy for the men who worked long and hard in very tough conditions. I'm not old enough to remember steam on British railways, but some of my earliest and fondest memories are of steam engines on preserved lines, and I still love visiting them now. This is the sound of the South's railways today. But I know what I prefer. The South's Last Day of Steam was written, researched and produced for BBC Radio Solent by Neil Sackley.